It's no secret that Tolkien was a big fan of Norse mythology. One of the most obvious influences comes from the Gylfaginning. When you read the names of the dwarves, you see names like Dwalin, Bifur, Bombur, Bofur, Ori, Oin, Gandalf, Fili, Kili, Fundin, Dori, Ori, Gloin. You see Tolkien's influence there in The Hobbit when he names all the dwarfs straight out of the Gylfaginning. So we can tell right away that there is a lot of influence with the Nordic mythology, giants, trolls, elves. All of these things come from the Norse. And a lot of people have pointed out that the Andvaranaut, Andvari's gift, the magic ring that could help in finding sources of gold. So it's no secret, everybody likes to talk about the Norse mythology angle on Tolkien and the influence there. It's definitely there. But what if I told you that Tolkien's biggest influence is actually Plato, the Greek philosopher? And if you go through Tolkien's letters and you do a search for Plato, you'll not find it mentioned a single time, nor will you ever find this mentioned amongst Tolkien fans and Tolkien scholars. They always focus on the Norse mythology, or there are a lot of Catholics out there who will tell you that Tolkien was 100% influenced by the Bible, and that there's nothing in there that comes from Norse myth or paganism in any way. And they do say this. There's a whole Wikipedia page devoted to that, which I think is ridiculous. But a lot of Norse scholars have kind of zeroed in on that and made the connection with Norse mythology. So here are some things to note that I picked up on, and I was surprised to find that I'm not the only person who's noticed this. I spent some time searching on the internet today, and there have been other people who have noticed the Plato connection with Tolkien, going back to the 1980s. But I'll tell you a couple of things that really gave this away for me. The Ring of Gyges from Plato, Republic Book 2, is, I think, the closest thing we have to what's going on in The Lord of the Rings, where they talk about a magic invisible ring, and they discuss exactly this. Whether or not if you put that ring on, you would obviously be tempted to do horrible things, and you'd be able to get away with it because you had that invisible ring. But the truly just man would be able to resist these temptations, and he would not do despicable things, whereas the unjust man would rapidly be corrupted by the ring, and he would be a slave to his appetites. So you have to be able to conquer the Ring of Gyges, and I believe that this basic premise here that they talk about in the Republic inspired Tolkien's whole thesis here with the Lord of the Rings and the conflict with the ring and having to kind of triumph over the ring and its corrupting influence. Whereas you see with Smeagol, he's the unjust man, and they contrast that with Frodo, who ultimately resists. He's able to resist the ring and doesn't use it for evil. So I thought that was actually very telling, and you'll not find this in any of Tolkien's letters, but it seemed pretty obvious to me. And Tolkien, of course, was a classical scholar. He was trained in classical Greek, could read Homer in classical Greek. I have no reason to believe that he was not well familiar with this, and it just seems so Tolkien, this whole parallel. It's strange to me that it's even up for debate, that people will deny it and say, no, Tolkien never read Plato, he was not influenced by that. Here is another thing that Tolkien borrowed from Plato that I picked up on. The fall of Numenor, the legendary island that Elendil and Aragorn's ancestors come from. In the Elvish language, the fall of Numenor is called the Atalante, right? Atlantis. So here's a section from the Critias by Plato, which almost reads like an introduction to the downfall of Numenor. And it's almost like Tolkien wanted to just complete this because the Critias was left unfinished. So this is interesting here. So he talks about how virtuous and powerful and wealthy the Atlanteans were. And then in the last section here he says, "But when the divine portion in them began to grow faint, as it was often blended with great quantities of mortality, and as their human nature gradually gained ascendancy, at that moment, in their inability to bear their great good fortune, they became disordered. To whoever had eyes to see, they appeared hideous, since they were losing the finest of what were once their most treasured possessions. But to those who were blind to the true way of life oriented to happiness, it was at this time that they gave the semblance of being supremely beauteous and blessed. Yet inwardly they were filled with an unjust lust for possessions and power. But as Zeus, god of the gods, reigning as king according to law, could clearly see this state of affairs, he observed this noble race lying in this abject state, and resolved to punish them, and to make them more careful and harmonious as a result of their chastisement. To this end he called all the gods to their most honored abode, which stands at the middle of the universe, and looks down upon all that has a share in generation. And when he gathered them together, he said," and then it ends right there. Now the interesting thing is this is Tolkien's allegory as well when he talks about Numenor, right? The Numenorians become too mighty, too proud. They lose their respect for the gods. They no longer are elf friends. They disrespect the elves. And they ultimately start worshiping a false god. Sauron becomes their high priest and corrupts them into worshiping Morgoth, who is the jealous god. He's jealous of the gods. He wants to be worshipped as the supreme ruler. So this ultimately leads to their ruin, and the gods set about to sink Atlantis, destroy Atlantis. And this is the same thing with Numenor. So you see again Tolkien's influence from Plato here. So I think it's fairly reasonable for me to conclude that he was heavily influenced by Plato here. Okay, so far we have the Ring of Gyges and the myth of Atlantis, which are clearly influenced from Plato. The next thing you'll notice with Tolkien is the theme of reincarnation, and this comes up over and over again. If you read Tolkien's letters, even the same letters where he says that Lord of the Rings is a deeply Catholic work, well, further on in those letters he talks about how Gandalf reincarnates. He doesn't, it's not a resurrection as a lot of people claim. He really dies and reincarnates in a new body, which explains why Aragorn and Legolas and Gimli don't recognize him at first. Because although he looks similar to his old body, he's not the same. He is different. And you'll see this reincarnation over and over again. So much so that he was criticized by a lot of Catholics at the time because he made reincarnation a theme. In one such letter, a Catholic bookshop owner, Peter Hastings, criticized Tolkien for putting reincarnation into the book. So here's Tolkien's response to this in letter 153. "But I do not see how even in the primary world any theologian or philosopher, unless very much better informed about the relation of spirit and body than I believe anyone to be, could deny the possibility of reincarnation as a mode of existence, prescribed for certain kinds of rational incarnate creatures." So here he actually goes further and defends the belief in reincarnation outside of his book. Inside the book, everyone knows, yes, the elves reincarnate, and seemingly other creatures do too. For example, hobbits. We have the case of the Barrow Downs. Remember what Mary says when he awakens from the Barrow Downs. He says, "Of course I remember," he says, "the men of Carn Dûm came on us at night, and we were worsted. Ah, the spear in my heart, he clutched at his breast. Merry then came to his senses. No, no, he said, what am I saying? I have been dreaming. And the original draft, he says, I begin to remember. I thought I was dead, but don't let us speak of it. So this shows that he was reincarnated from one of the men of the North Kingdom at the Barrow Downs. And it actually makes sense that the hobbits would be. Because he writes in there, they go into the Barrow Downs and they retrieve old daggers from the Dunedain. So it all makes sense if they were Dunedain in a previous life. You also have a lot of other very telling statements here. Like at the end when Sam says, you know, I've come back, and Rosie says to him, they said you were dead, but I've been expecting you. And he draws a deep breath and says, well, I'm back. You know, little things like that, little hints like that, kind of shows the theme of, you know, it puts a whole new meaning to the term there and back again. Remember the Hobbit's Tale, there and back again? The themes with there and back again. The fact that hobbits themselves live in mounds, right? Like burial mounds. It's just very interesting stuff with how he picked this, the symbolism. If you do read Tolkien's letters, which is what the Catholics always just want to cite that one letter over and over again, but if you do read some of the other letters, he explicitly talks about Gandalf's reincarnation, and he uses the word reincarnation. Shadowfax as being a reincarnation of the Lord of Horses. Sauron reincarnates as well. From the Second Age, when he was Anatar, he reincarnates into being a being of pure evil. And then you also have Durin, the Lord of the Dwarves. They call him Durin the Deathless. And the dwarves believe that each generation Durin reincarnates into the next Durin as the king of the dwarves. And that's why they call him Durin the Deathless. He's always reincarnating. So you do see reincarnation over and over again, and that is very much another Platonic theme, is reincarnation as well. So we have the Ring of Gygas being the inspiration for the Ring of Power, the magic ring that makes you invisible, that corrupts you with the power of the gods. We have the myth of Atlantis being used for Numenor, the fall of Numenor. And we have the theme of reincarnation popping up over and over again. And here's another big one that I've noticed. In Tolkien's Silmarillion, he has the main creator god is called Eru Ilúvatar. And Eru means the one in Elvish, the one, right? Now anybody who's read Plato or Plotinus knows the one is something very unique to their philosophy. And it's very interesting that Tolkien used that word, because in the Catholic system, God is a trinity. He's not the one, he's a trinity. So right there you see a big departure from all the people who claim that this is such a Christian work. You see a big departure there, and he actually embraces the Platonic term, the one. And then of course Ilúvatar, all Father, you can clearly see that. That's a Nordic term, also used in Celtic as well. So I was thinking about where Tolkien got this idea to combine the Platonic one with the Norse All-Father. And I did find something from one of his contemporaries in the 1920s that is very similar to this. And this was a very popular book at the time. It's called The Secret Teachings of All Ages by Manly P. Hall. And I think this would have been a pretty big influence, because this is around the same time Tolkien would have been coming up with the main ideas of the Silmarillion here in the 1920s. Now listen to what Manly P. Hall says here. He says, the supreme invisible creator of all things was called All-Father. His regent in nature was Odin, the one-eyed god. So there you have a very Platonic approach to Norse mythology, where he's differentiating and he's saying, no, the All-Father is the supreme deity of the universe, and Odin is actually just a regent, right? Like, and if you read Tolkien's letters, he talks about this a lot too, with his idea of what he says is pure monotheism, where you have the one and the gods, and he does use the word the gods over and over again, are actually more like regents of nature, governors more so. And that's a very Neoplatonic approach as well, where you have kind of like this cosmic intelligence, and then you have the gods, who are, I think he even says, the first emanations from the one. So all of this to me seems very Neoplatonic. I don't see anything Christian about this. There's no Trinity, there's no heaven and hell. He explicitly says that there are gods, right? So it's polytheistic. Although he calls it pure monotheism, that's not what pure monotheism. I mean, if that's pure monotheism, then Plato was a pure monotheist. If that's what Tolkien thinks is pure monotheism, or the Hindus are, right? Because they have Brahm, which is like the one, and then the gods under that. The gods emanate from that. So you see that kind of fits perfectly with Tolkien's worldview. So it's a Neoplatonic take on Norse mythology, and that seems to have been popular around that time.